Winter in Dove Creek did not fall with snow that year. It simply settled over the land like a long, exhaled sigh. The air carried the dry chill of a world holding its breath, and the sun, pale and weary, dragged thin ribbons of light across the earth. Every plank of every building looked older in that washed-out glow. Every boot step echoed a little sharper. And behind the mail-order barn, where the frost clung to tools and the wind curled through broken slats, a giant of a man swung an axe as though trying to keep the cold from entering his bones. Taza Red Elk worked without sound, without complaint, without expectation of thanks. His muscles gleamed faintly in the winter light, the copper warmth of his skin, the only color brave enough to stand against the muted day. Each strike of his axe cleaved the wood clean, but the rhythm was more than labor. It was the steady beat of a man who carried loneliness like a second heart, quiet but constant, heavy but familiar. He had come to Dove Creek because a letter had asked him to. A widow, frightened, isolated, desperate, had requested a husband from the mail-order listings out of sheer need. She wanted strength, protection, someone unmovable. And when Taza answered, traveling miles across harsh terrain, she met him once, trembled at the sight of his size and heritage, and told him she had changed her mind. She shut her door, leaving him on the porch with nothing but his silence. The town let him stay in the barn loft. They let him chop their wood. They let him exist so long as he did not get too close. He told himself it was enough. A roof, a blanket, something to do with his hands. But sometimes at dusk, when lanterns glowed golden windows and families gathered at supper tables, a hollow ache murmured inside him like an old wound that refused to heal. That was when he first saw Lydia May Harrow. She stepped out of her father's old general store, carrying a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Her shawl fluttered around her shoulders like wings refusing to fold. She was 22, lovely in a way Dove Creek tried not to notice, with eyes the color of warm amber, and a quiet strength woven through every movement she made. Her father had died in early autumn, leaving her to run the store alone. Men circled her gently at first, then greedily when they saw how vulnerable grief had made her. She ignored them all with soft but steady refusal. But she didn't ignore Taza. That first evening, she approached him with hesitant steps. Not fearful. Not curious. Simply kind. She held the bread out to him, as if offering something sacred. "You look cold," she murmured, though her voice slipped into the winter air like a breeze rather than a sentence. He blinked, stunned by a gentleness he hadn't earned. Their eyes met for the briefest breath, and something stirred, something he pushed down quickly. He thanked her in a low, rumbling voice, and she smiled, not out of politeness but sincerity. Then she walked back to her store without looking over her shoulder, trusting him without even trying. He carried that moment for days. He didn't know that she carried it too. Every morning when she opened the store, she glanced toward the barn. Not obviously, not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough to reassure herself that the towering, silent man was still there. Something about him made her breathing steadier. Something in his presence reminded her she was not as alone as the world kept insisting. Yet even as she found solace in the idea of him, a growing dread curled slowly through her days. The trouble began with two men. Strangers at first. They came into her store just after dusk, claiming they were passing through, asking too many questions about her father's assets, her debts, her living arrangements. Their smiles were polite, their eyes were not. She sent them away with a warning she hoped sounded firmer than she felt. But they returned the next day. And the next. By the third visit, they no longer hid their intent. They circled her shelves like wolves growing fond of their prey. They spoke of unpaid accounts, of land disputes, of the dangers of a young woman living alone. Lydia listened with her hands trembling behind her back, refusing to let them see the fear they wanted. But fear followed her home. It did not leave her when she locked the store. It did not leave her when she crawled into bed. It lay beside her in the dark, whispering that she could not face this threat alone. Her only comfort, her only thought of safety, was the giant who never stepped inside her store, but was always near, always steady, always watching with the quiet awareness of someone who'd spent his life reading danger. One evening, as a dusty red dusk bled across the town, Lydia stood at her door, heart pounding with a resolve she barely understood. A lantern dangled from her hand, its soft flame flickering against her skin. She wrapped her shawl tightly across her chest and walked toward the barn with purpose so fragile it might shatter with a single misstep. Inside, Taza sat on a crate, mending a leather strap. The dim light painted shadows across his broad shoulders. He heard her footsteps before she reached the door, and he stood, instinctively straightening as if bracing for judgment. But Lydia's face held no judgment, only fear, and beneath it, something like trust fighting to survive. She stopped in front of him, breath unsteady, lantern trembling just enough to betray her courage. "Taza," she whispered, voice barely more than a breath in the cold. I need your help." He frowned, confused, concerned, his hands stilling at his sides. She swallowed, gathering herself. Then, with the weight of desperation and the tenderness of a plea she wished she didn't have to make, she whispered the words that would change everything. "Can you act as my husband?" And in the silence that followed, the winter itself seemed to stop to listen. The words hung between them like breath suspended in cold air. Taza did not move at first, as though his body needed time to understand what his ears had heard. Lydia stood before him with her lantern trembling at her side, the soft flame casting gold shadows across her frightened eyes. She looked so small in the barn's vast dimness, so breakable and yet so brave, holding his gaze with a kind of fragile determination that pulled at something deep within him. Winter pressed through the slats, slipping around them in thin ribbons of cold, but her presence brought a strange warmth to the room. He set down the leather strap he had been mending. The air thickened with everything he wished he could say and everything he feared saying. She waited, her breath hitching almost imperceptibly, as though she stood on the edge of a decision she would never be able to take back. "Lydia," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, "you don't know what you're asking." Her shoulders tightened. "I do," she whispered. "More than you think." Her lantern flickered again, briefly illuminating the worry etched into her brow. She wasn't asking him because she wanted a husband, he saw that immediately. She was asking him because she needed safety, and she believed, against all logic or prejudice, that he was the one person who would grant it without taking anything from her in return. He took a slow step toward her, careful not to startle her. "You deserve a man the town respects. A man who gives you a good name, not a burden." She shook her head before he finished. "I don't need a name. I need protection. Those men, they're not just talking anymore. They're circling. They're waiting for a moment when I'm alone." He felt something tighten in his chest. Anger, protective instinct, disbelief that anyone would prey on a woman who spoke so softly yet carried so much weight in her heart. "Why me?" he asked, though the question slipped out more vulnerable than he intended. Her eyes softened, but her voice held its trembling honesty. "Because when you look at me, you don't see someone to own. You see someone to guard. And I trust that more than anything." Taza swallowed, the rare sting of emotion thickening his throat. No one had ever spoken about trust in relation to him. Most kept their distance. Many kept their fears. Lydia stood here instead, asking him to stand beside her, even if only for protection. He exhaled slowly, the decision forming from instinct rather than reason. "If I do this, people will talk." "Let them," she breathed. "I've lived with whispers my whole life. They hurt less than the thought of those men waiting in the dark." Her confession settled over him like snowfall that never touched the ground, quiet, gentle, heavy in its impact. He saw the exhaustion in her posture, the trembling hope she tried to hide. And he understood then that this wasn't a plan she had prepared. It wasn't a scheme. It was a plea born of fear and courage in equal measure. "I'll walk with you tomorrow," he said finally. "Stand by your store. Let them see I'm not someone they want to challenge." A breath left her lips, half relief, half disbelief. "Thank you" didn't seem to be a large enough phrase for what she felt, but she whispered it anyway, the word floating between them like a fragile offering. When she turned to leave, he noticed how her hands shook beneath the lantern's glow. Without thinking, he reached out gently and touched her elbow. She froze, but not in fear, more as though surprised by the warmth of another human hand. "You won't face them alone anymore," he murmured. "Not while I'm here." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something softer, recognition, perhaps, or the faint beginning of trust deepening into something more substantial. She nodded, then slipped out into the night, the lantern's light bobbing like a heartbeat as she walked back toward town. Taza watched her until the flame vanished. Only when darkness swallowed the path did he return to the loft, though he did not sleep. He lay awake listening to the winter wind pressing against the barn walls, wondering what it meant to be chosen even temporarily. Wondering what it meant to be needed not for labor or strength, but for presence itself. The next morning came with pale sunlight that barely warmed the frost-laced ground. Lydia was already sweeping the steps of her store when Taza approached, his long stride slowing as he neared her, conscious of the eyes gathering even before he reached the porch. She lifted her head, startled at first, then steadied by his presence. She gave him the smallest smile, a silent thank you for keeping his word. Without speaking, he stepped beside her, close enough that passers-by would draw their own conclusions, far enough to give her space to breathe. People stared. Some whispered. Jonas Pike, the man who once tried loudly to court her, narrowed his eyes from across the street. But Lydia stood taller than she had the day before. She swept the last of the dust aside, and opened her door, as though nothing in the world could push her smaller again. Inside the store, she moved with a different sort of rhythm, more careful, more aware of her surroundings. Taza stood near the counter, not looming, not guarding aggressively, just existing like a wall no one could move. More customers came than usual, some out of curiosity, others out of unease. A few murmured greetings at Lydia but refused to meet Taza's eyes. Still, he remained silent, unmoved. At midday, Lydia brought him a cup of warm tea. Her hands brushed his as she passed it to him, and the brief contact startled them both. She pulled back quickly, blushing, and he lowered his gaze, unsure why warmth curled beneath his chest at the touch. He reminded himself this was pretend, temporary, necessary only for her safety. Yet the town's whispers grew louder as the hours passed. People noticed how Lydia gravitated toward him, unconsciously stepping closer when someone unfamiliar entered. They noticed how Taza watched the street with the stillness of a man who could read danger long before it arrived. And they noticed the two strangers returning, pausing at the store's entrance, eyes narrowing at the towering figure by Lydia's side. When afternoon slid into early dusk, Lydia locked the store door. She lingered on the final latch, her fingers trembling again. Taza watched her with quiet concern. "Did they come today?" he asked softly. She nodded without looking at him. They didn't say anything. Just watched. He stepped closer, careful as always, until she finally turned toward him. Her breath clouded faintly in the cooling air. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I can't do this alone, Taza. I'm trying to be strong, but every night feels heavier than the last." Something inside him shifted. A small, quiet shift, but enough to alter everything. He had seen her determination. He had seen her fear. But hearing it, hearing her admit weakness without shame, stirred a protective fire in him he had never known for any stranger. "You won't," he said. "Not anymore." They walked together through the fading light, the distance between them diminishing not through touch but through something deeper. Something neither understood yet both could feel. Their shadows stretched across the ground like two lengths of the same night. As they neared the barn, Lydia stopped suddenly. Taza halted beside her, waiting. She looked up at him, her face soft, wind-touched, uncertain but hopeful in a way that threatened to unmake him. "Taza," she whispered, "I need to know, are you only doing this out of duty?" He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, footsteps scraped across the road behind them. Lydia's face paled. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, approaching. Taza turned, every muscle tensing. And from the shadows stepped the two men who had been haunting her days and nights, their silhouettes framed by the dying sun. They stopped several paces away, their expressions carved with intent that stripped the winter air of all remaining warmth. "Evening," one of them drawled. "Looks like we caught you both at the perfect time." Lydia's breath hitched. And Taza stepped forward, jaw set, the quiet promise of danger radiating from him like heat. The night, it seemed, had chosen its moment. The tension of the previous night lingered like a thin frost over the ground as dawn slipped into Dove Creek. Lydia walked beside Taza toward the store, the townsfolk noticing immediately. Conversations paused mid-sentence, glances flickered sharp as flint, and doorways suddenly seemed busier, as people leaned out to catch sight of the unlikely pair moving through the quiet street. Lydia felt the eyes settle on her, but she did not shrink. Taza walked with even steps, broad shoulders relaxed but alert, as though absorbing the weight of the stairs so she would not have to. Something in his presence steadied her breath, reminding her with each passing second that she was not facing the day alone. Entering the store felt different with him behind her. Lydia lit the oil lamp and turned the sign to open, her hand steadying only when she saw Taza take his position near the counter, standing not as a shield, but as a presence that changed the room's balance. Customers arrived hesitantly at first. Some offered Lydia polite greetings while avoiding Taza entirely. Others stared too long, trying to decide whether they disapproved or were simply confused. Lydia forced herself to move naturally, arranging jars and sorting inventory, though her mind kept circling the two men who had confronted them, their shadows lingering in memory like smudges she couldn't erase. Near midday, Jonas Pike sauntered in, his boots loud, his posture exaggerated. He tipped his hat at Lydia with a smirk and tossed a quick, mocking glance toward Taza. "Rough choice for a husband," he drawled, voice dripping with smugness. Lydia's cheeks warmed, anger flaring beneath her calm expression, but she focused on her work, refusing to feed his arrogance. Taza said nothing. His silence was not weakness but warning, and Jonas felt it enough to stop talking. Throughout the afternoon, Lydia found herself aware of every shift in the room. Taza's presence altered how people behaved. A few customers lingered longer than needed, testing his patience with bold, assessing stares. Others hurried through their purchases, discomfort plain in their stiff shoulders. Lydia tried to remain anchored, grounding herself in the simple motions of her work, but her pulse quickened whenever the door creaked open. As afternoon unfolded into a softer light, Lydia stepped outside to shake crumbs from a burlap sack. The cold air rushed into her lungs, sharp and cleansing. She gathered her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She watched Taza for a heartbeat, a giant made gentle by restraint, a warrior made quiet by choice. When he looked back at her, his expression softened, not into a smile but into something calmer, something that made her chest ache with an emotion neither expectation nor fear could name. They returned inside just as one of the two men entered again, pretending to browse. His presence clung to the air like smoke. Taza stepped between him and Lydia, unmoving. The man's confidence faltered, and he retreated without a purchase, leaving Lydia's heart beating faster than before. Taza's voice came low afterwards. "You are safe." She nodded, though safety felt fragile. By dusk, Lydia locked the store door with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. Taza noticed, though he said nothing, simply stepping closer so the dimming street felt less empty. They walked toward the barn in silence, the world shrinking to the sound of their footsteps and the soft hum of winter settling over the town. When they reached the edge of the barn's shadow, Lydia stopped. The distance between her courage and her fear closed suddenly, and she turned toward him, her breath visible in the cooling air. "It felt different today," she whispered. "Having you near." Taza studied her, uncertainty and something deeper flickering through his dark eyes. "You needed protection. I gave what I could." But her voice, when she spoke again, carried a softness that unsettled him. "It wasn't just protection. I felt seen. And that frightened me more than the men did." He looked down, troubled by the truth he sensed behind her words. Lydia had built her life around silence and self-reliance. To lean on anyone, even briefly, made her vulnerable in ways she didn't yet understand. Before he could respond, footsteps scraped behind them. Lydia's breath hitched. Taza tensed, turning sharply. Both men approached, the tall one grinning, the shorter clutching a folded paper. The tall man stopped several paces away, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Evening, miss," he said, gaze sliding toward Taza. "Seems your husband forgot to settle the accounts your father left behind." Lydia's heart sank. "My father had no debts. We kept careful records." The shorter man snorted, unfolding the paper. "Debts can appear, depending on who's searching. This land, this store, it's worth something. And we're here to collect." Taza's jaw tightened as he stepped between Lydia and the men. "Leave." His voice rumbled low, almost like distant thunder. The taller man chuckled, stepping forward. Or what? You'll fight for a woman who ain't even yours? The question struck deeper than it should have. Lydia's breath caught sharply. Taza felt something shift inside him, a force rising from the quiet space where emotion and instinct met. The men eyed him with dark amusement. The tall one leaned in. Maybe you should prove she's yours. Otherwise, step aside and let real business be done. The threat, spoken with such casual cruelty, cracked the last of Taza's restraint. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming, his silence transforming into something fierce and unyielding. The men hesitated, searching for bravado that suddenly faltered. Lydia, standing behind him, felt it too, a change in the air in him and herself. Something unspoken had awakened, bending the shape of the moment and the bond between them. The air trembled with meaning as they turned toward the approaching figure, uncertain whether the night was bringing danger or deliverance. Lydia felt her heart rise and fall like a fragile lantern flame, and Taza braced himself for whatever truth stepped into the fading light. Taza felt the weight of the night press against his shoulders, long after the two men disappeared into the dark. Their threats had slithered into the silence, leaving behind a chill deeper than winter air. Lydia stood beside him, her breath trembling, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her shawl. For a moment, they simply stared at the empty road, as though expecting danger to reappear. But when nothing moved, when the last echo of the men's footsteps dissolved into the quiet, Lydia exhaled shakily, and turned toward him with gratitude shimmering faintly in her eyes. That was the beginning of his unraveling. What she felt as gratitude, he mistook as need. What she saw as partnership, he saw as burden. And before she could speak, before she could thank him with warmth he did not believe he deserved, Taza stepped back, his gaze dropping to the ground. "You should go inside," he murmured, his voice dimmed by something heavy. She blinked, surprised by the distance he was creating. "Taza, are you all right?" He nodded once, avoiding her eyes, then turned sharply toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the deepening dusk. The next morning, the sun rose with a thin wash of gold, but nothing in him felt bright. Taza worked through the early hours without once looking toward the store. He chopped wood until sweat slicked his skin despite the cold. He tried to lose himself in labor, in repetition, in anything that could drown out the memory of her voice softening when she said she felt seen. But her words haunted him, whispering through him like a warmth he was certain he had imagined. By midday, Lydia stepped into the barn doorway, carrying a tin cup of warm tea. She hesitated, watching him work, noticing how he didn't glance her way even when she cleared her throat softly. Usually he sensed her before she reached him. Today he kept his back turned, each movement of the axe heavy and deliberate. "I brought you tea," she said gently. He paused but didn't look over his shoulder. "Thank you. Leave it there." She stiffened at his cold tone. "Something wrong?" "No," he muttered. "You should be at the store." "No one will come in anyway," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "They stare at us more than they buy." Still no response. She stepped closer, snow dust crunching beneath her boots. "Taza, look at me." He stilled, axe lowering until it dug slightly into the ground. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned. Their eyes met, hers full of worry, his shadowed by something wounded and unreachable. "Why are you pulling away?" she asked softly. "Did I do something?" "You didn't do anything," he said, but the roughness of his voice betrayed him. "I just think this arrangement should end soon." Her breath faltered. "End? Why?" "It's safer for me with you near." "I know. Then why?" "Because people are talking. Because they think you want a husband, not protection. Because they think you want me." Lydia's lips parted, stunned, but he continued before she could speak. "You deserve someone they'll accept. Someone your father would have approved of. Someone who doesn't make your life harder by standing at your side." The pain in his tone stung sharper than the words themselves. She took a step forward, but he stepped back. "I won't let my presence ruin your place in this town. You asked for help. I gave what I could. But pretending to be your husband, even for safety, it's already gone too far." Lydia felt something inside her crack. "You think I care what they say?" He shook his head. You should. Reputation is everything here.
More than safety?
She whispered.
More than truth?
His jaw tightened. I'm leaving after winter. This job, this town, none of it needs me. You don't need me. Her breath splintered. That's not true. You don't understand. I do, he replied, lowering his gaze. You asked for safety, not for me. Lydia's eyes glistened, not with tears but with disbelief at the wall he was building between them. She wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to pull him back toward her with the same instinct that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Instead, she turned away, hurt threading through her ribs like barbed wire. If that's what you believe, then nothing I say will matter. Her voice broke only at the very end. She left the barn quietly, her footsteps soft, her heart rattling like loose glass inside her chest. Taza watched her go, each step she took away from him tightening something around his lungs. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He told himself she would recover from the loss of his presence far quicker than from the scandal of their arrangement. But when the barn door shut and her absence filled the empty space, something inside him felt hollow, like a door slamming shut on a room he'd never even been allowed to enter. Hours passed with the weight of unspoken things pressing against both of them. Lydia forced herself through her work, stacking jars and sweeping counters with hands that trembled more than she liked. She kept replaying his words. Not the rejection itself, but the certainty with which he believed she couldn't want him. His gentleness had steadied her. His presence had felt like home. And now he was pulling away as if she'd asked for something she never had. Night arrived early, draping the town in blue stillness. Lydia stayed late at the store, sorting through old boxes in the back room, trying to drown out her thoughts with labor. She didn't hear the door creak open until a floorboard groaned, sharp and unfamiliar. She spun around. Two silhouettes blocked her only exit, the same men from the road, their eyes gleaming with intent no longer disguised. "Evening, miss," one drawled, voice slick as oil. "We warned you about settling your father's debts. Time's up." Lydia's breath caught. She stepped back instinctively, bumping into a shelf. The lantern trembled in her hand, shadows jumping across the walls. She wanted to scream, but fear tightened her throat, trapping the sound inside her chest. The taller man advanced, smirking. "No husband here tonight, huh? Shame. Would have been fun to watch him try." Lydia's heart pounded wildly. For the first time all day, her mind screamed one name. Taza. As if the thought were a summons, a distant thud echoed from the street. Footsteps, fast, heavy, purposeful. The men turned. Lydia froze, hope flickering dangerously in her chest. And then the door burst open, splintering against the wall as Taza stormed in, breath sharp, eyes blazing with a fury carved from fear, and something deeper he could no longer deny. The men spun around, startled by the sheer force of his presence. Lydia's lantern shook violently in her hand. Taza didn't speak. He didn't have to. The storm inside him had finally broken. Taza crossed the ruined doorframe, as though breaking through the last wall he had ever built around himself. The two men froze, their bravado slipping the way dust slides off glass. The room held a restless silence between them. Lydia stood behind the counter, lantern clutched to her chest, her breath trembling like a trapped bird. The moment their eyes met, the storm inside him sharpened into purpose, his feet finding their path before his mind could catch up. "Leave," Taza said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. The shorter man reached for something in his coat, but Taza stepped forward with such certainty that both men stumbled backward. They muttered threats, promises, curses, but none held weight against the fire burning in his gaze. Within seconds they rushed out, slamming the night shut behind them. Taza exhaled, the tension leaving his body in a long, shaking breath. Lydia set the lantern down, fingers trembling. Taza moved toward her slowly, each step heavy with the fear he had felt when he heard her scream. Her name slipped from him softly, torn from the deepest part of his chest. She lifted her eyes to him, and in that fragile golden glow he saw everything he had been trying to avoid. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, though tears shimmered in her lashes. "No. Not now." Silence settled over them, vast as the plains outside. Taza felt his pulse thunder in his ears, the aftershock of almost losing her unraveling the last threads of his restraint. "I should have been here," he murmured. "I left you when you needed me. I walked away because I thought you wanted someone better. Someone whole. Someone accepted." Lydia stepped closer, her voice breaking on the edges. "I wanted you. I never asked for a husband. I asked for the man who made me feel safe just by standing near. You kept pulling away, and I kept thinking it was my fault." He bowed his head, unable to bear the weight of her pain. "It wasn't you. It was me. I watched the way people looked at us. I listened to their whispers. And I told myself you deserved a man they would welcome. A man whose presence wouldn't stain your name. A man who wasn't me." She reached out, touching his hand with trembling fingers. Her voice softened into something that felt almost like a vow. "My name isn't worth much if I'm too afraid to stand beside the one person who's ever seen me clearly." Her touch made his breath falter. He had faced storms without blinking, crossed barren lands without fear, but this, her gentleness, unmade him. "Lydia," he whispered, "I don't know how to be what you deserve." She shook her head, tears slipping free. "You already are." He lifted his gaze slowly, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. Her face glowed in the lantern light, soft, resolute, brave in ways she didn't realize. And something in him broke open, spilling truth he had buried for years. "I tried not to feel anything for you. I tried to stay distant. But every day I stood beside you, something in me changed. I would have died for you long before tonight. Not because you needed protection. Because I loved you quietly, and I thought it was better if you never knew." The words fell between them like warm rain on frozen ground. Lydia inhaled sharply, her hand rising to his cheek, her palm cold but steady. Her voice trembled like a flame in a gentle wind. "You think that's something I wouldn't want? You think I didn't feel it too?" His breath shuddered out of him, disbelief and longing colliding inside him with a force that left him almost unsteady. Lydia stepped closer until the space between them dissolved, until her forehead rested against his chest, until his heartbeat echoed through her like a promise. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her to him with a reverence he had never felt for anything on earth. She melted into him, tears soaking into his skin, her breath warm against his collarbone. In that embrace, winter softened, and the world outside seemed to quiet in acknowledgement. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes shone with something fierce and tender. "Stay," she whispered. "Don't leave when winter ends. Don't leave at all." Taza cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the trace of a tear. "I won't leave if you want me here. But only if it's truth, not fear, that ties you to me." She smiled. A small, trembling smile that felt like sunrise after years of darkness. "It's truth. Not fear. Not need. Just you." The room held its breath as he lowered his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling. For the first time, hope didn't feel dangerous. Outside, a commotion rose, the sheriff's voice shouting, boots thundering across the street as the two men were caught attempting to flee town. Through the window, lanterns danced in the night as justice finally arrived. Lydia glanced toward the noise, then back at him, her voice a whisper of awe. "It's ending." "No," he murmured, pulling her close once more. "It's beginning." She rested against him, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, as though it were the first real home she had ever known. And in that quiet, with danger fading and dawn waiting just beyond the horizon, Taza realized the truth. Love had not found him because he deserved it. It had found him because he had finally let himself be seen. Inside, Lydia and Taza stood wrapped in the promise of something new, something tender, something stronger than fear or winter or the whispers of any town. A life built not from pretense, but from the raw courage of two hearts choosing the same path. "I'm yours if you'll have me." Lydia's answer was a soft smile pressed against his chest, a whisper rising like dawn. "I already do."